We've had lots of questions come in this week about defection, prompted by that surprise and somewhat contentious defection of the once Conservative MP for Dover and Deal, Natalie Elphicke, to Labour. OK, so we did cover the Elphicke defection on the podcast last week, but things were still very, very fresh. It had just happened. Have things settled down now, do you think, or is this going to continue to plague both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer?
Well, we've had a week of speculation that there would be a third, a hat-trick of defections. Dan Poulter 1 week, Natalie Elphicke the next. Was there going to be a third? And it all got a bit over the top in PMQs, just before PMQs this week, as MPs were filing into the chamber on the Labour benches. Every time a Conservative came in, they went, oh, to see if they would sit down next to Keir Starmer. And then they went and sat down on the Conservative benches. It was,
I'm not sure the Chief Whip is. Right, let us...
And it was quite funny, but it was also really quite unserious. And there was some serious business going on at the House at the time. Kemi Badenoch was answering equalities questions, some of which were, on quite substantive issues. And it had this sort of playground mentality. Anyway, there wasn't another defection. There was also a list that got sent round, I think by Labour people having a bit of a laugh of potential Conservatives who might be tempted over. I was chatting to some Tory MPs who were on that list, who were sort of fielding panicked calls from the whips going, is this actually something you're thinking about? And no, it's not. I think Damien Green was on that list.
I think Theresa May was on it as well.
Theresa May was on that list. Theresa May wore red shoes on Wednesday until Wednesday morning. It was she's wearing red shoes. Theresa May has worn red shoes quite a few times. Nothing to do with party affiliation. She's got a very good shoe game, actually. So, yes, lots of speculation. I think the consensus is that talks may be ongoing with some MPs who are still not happy, but I don't think we're going to see an imminent, dramatic floor crossing like Elphicke's again. I could be wrong. I think if it was going to happen, it probably would have happened this week, because that's when all the speculation was reaching a fever pitch.
Do you agree, David?
Yes, I think that's right. Look, if I was Labour, they could be having a lovely time over this and winding people up. And I was talking to a shadow cabinet minister on Monday. Right, actually, it was a public event with Wes Streeting, and he was very keen to talk about the possibility of defections to Labour, and part of the purpose of all of this is to demoralise the Conservatives. And I know one of the names that was being talked about in the media and was having a WhatsApp exchange with this person who was at one level rather amused by it, because really wasn't going to cross this person's mind to join Labour, but there's lots of speculation. So it's clearly being used by Labour to destabilise. And there's always a huge amount of uncertainty over these things. I would imagine they're very often last minute decisions, until someone has actually physically done it and crossed the floor and sat on the other benches. There's always a chance they might bottle out. So, nothing is completely guaranteed until the very end. But yeah, look, this is a chance to try to destabilise and demoralise the Conservative Party. And of course, Labour are going to want to talk about this probably in the run-up of every PMQs for the rest of the summer.
I'm going to come to our listener questions in a minute, but it's interesting you talk about Wes Streeting there, obviously shadow cabinet. I was talking to some backbench Labour MPs earlier in the week who say, really, you cannot overstate the strength of feeling on the backbenches about how unhappy they are about the fact that Natalie Elphicke has been opened with seemingly open arms. They're really angry.
Yeah, and I think much more so than they were with Dan Poulter, who is an NHS doctor, walked across the floor because he had strong concerns about the direction of the NHS under the Conservatives. You can kind of see that. Elphicke's move doesn't really make sense ideologically, and a lot of anger in particular that she has been welcomed into the Labour Party. Diane Abbott is still suspended pending an investigation, and there's a sense of a sort of double standard there. And also she did have to address, which we talked about on the podcast last week, the comments she made about the victims of her ex-husband when he was convicted for sexual assault. And she has apologised for that and explained her reasoning and her thinking and how stressful and difficult that time was for her. But I think it's interesting that she did have to do that, and that she did it after the wave of outrage rather than kind of at any point in the last couple of years when she could have done. So yeah, the strength of feeling is still really, really raw, I think.
Yeah, and I think this is touched on by one of our listeners, Jonathan. I want to put this to you, David. So Jonathan says, "Hello, NS podcast. I'm a lifelong fan."
Thank you, Jonathan.
That's very nice to hear. And it's a very long question, so forgive me. I'm going to paraphrase it. But what he says is, what I don't understand is why this was thought to require that Elphicke become a sitting Labour MP. That is, she's discouraged by the direction of travel by the Tories. Why would she simply not leave the Tories, sit in Parliament as an independent MP, and provide an endorsement for Labour on the basis of her arguments about them having a better plan to stop the boats? Why do you think that? I mean, she's not a fit, is she, for the Labour Party, David? Why not just sit as an independent?
I think that's a very good question. And I think, from the outside, it is a little bit of a mystery as to why Natalie Elphicke has done what she has done. You can see from Labour's point of view, to get the full defection, for her to properly come over the theatre of Prime Minister's Question Time and her walking in and sitting over. You can see why Labour would prefer to do that. And I suppose from Natalie Elphicke's point of view is there's no point in half measures. If you're going to endorse Labour, then why not become a Labour MP? And there will be cynical explanations that this makes a more attractive proposition in the private sector subsequently. It's hard to say. I think the argument for Labour, by the way, on this is very specific to the fact that she is the Dover MP. And I do think it's a defensive move because of small boats, and to have her, on Friday last week after the defection, at an event with Yvette Cooper, and Keir Starmer, and saying, Labour have got a better plan on small boats than the Tories, is really, really useful to Labour, even though I can completely see why it's uncomfortable for the reasons that Rachel has talked about. And I have to say, if I was to come up with a list of people who I thought might join the Labour Party, Natalie Elphicke wouldn't have been on that list.
Go on then. Tell us who's on your list.
Well, if I was to do that, I'm not going to do that. But nor, by the way, is Theresa May on that list. So, no, I think it's an odd one. And, ideologically, she's come from the populist right. That's her political background. And I think it does raise some interesting questions about Labour's overall strategy. Who are the Tory voters that they're after? Are they the if you like, the more liberal, probably Remain voting types of voters, or are they the more Leave voting, working class, populists, perhaps had voted Labour in the past? That's not Natalie Elphicke, but that's the sort of type of politics that she represents. That does seem to me that the sort of the overall strategy that Labour are going for, probably because there are more of those types of voters and they're in perhaps more importantly placed seats, some of those marginal seats. That's their short-term strategy.
We heard Labour's Pat McFadden defend this yesterday morning, both how to square the situation with Diane Abbott, who's been waiting for 13 months with still no conclusion, versus this warm welcome to someone on the right of the Conservative Party, Natalie Elphicke. And he was actually sort of not terribly robust on the Abbott point, but talking about Elphicke said, well, we need to win over voters that are Conservative voters. That's who we need to win over, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think Natalie Elphicke is a great symbol of that. If what you want to signal is the Labour Party currently now under Keir Starmer is a place that you, a former Conservative, can feel comfortable in and can trust. And if you vote for us and come and support us, we will welcome you and we will respect you. That's a really important message. If you've just lost an election, you don't win the next election by saying everyone who didn't vote for us are terrible people, which is a mistake that I think Labour has made in some recent elections. If you didn't vote for us, if you didn't support us then, we don't want you. People tend to go, fine, we won't vote for you. And there is a sense of sort of how this is being talked about and discussed in Westminster among very political people versus what the general public who aren't that interested in politics will see, which is somebody who is a Conservative and who really cares about the issue of small boats and legal migration, thinks Keir Starmer has a better plan to secure the borders than Rishi Sunak does. That's a really powerful message. So I can see why having her as a Labour MP works more in Labour's favour on that particular metric than just having her as an independent. On the question of what's in it for her, I was actually reminded of Chris Skidmore, who was a Conservative MP, a Conservative minister, who not only quit the Conservative Party, but announced that he was standing down as an MP immediately. And that's why we had a by-election in his seat in February. And I went to interview him just before that by-election. And I kind of said, why did you do that? Why didn't you just, resign the whip and sit as an independent for the next 6 months or however much? And he had a number of answers to that question. But basically, the main one was he wanted a by-election because he wanted to make a statement. And his statement was about the U-turn over net zero measures. And he wanted to signal that the Uxbridge by-election from last year, where the Conservatives narrowly won it, that wasn't where the public was on the issue of net zero. And he wanted to force a conversation basically of how disappointed and angry he was with the Conservative Party for that particular betrayal. He wouldn't have been able to make that case if he just resigned the whip. And I wonder if there's a similar thing going on with Elphicke, in that if you want to make a statement, you have to do more than just resign the whip. Everyone's losing the whip at the moment for all kinds of reasons. It's the reason we're still talking about it a week later is because she did something more dramatic, more substantial, and that's why we're talking about her. We know her name.
Well, quite. But Lizzie asked this question, are there any Tory MPs that Keir Starmer wouldn't accept into the Labour Party? If Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, wanted to join, would he be allowed? Does the Labour right only care about entryism from the left? David?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I confess I was on another podcast earlier this week and... don't say
betrayal. You defected.
I know. Should I stop there? But I asked this question of Alistair Campbell, who said, well, Suella Braverman and Liz Truss, for example, would be on the list of people not to take. No, I think there will be limits because there does come a point where, as Neil Kinnock has said, it's a broad church, but it does have walls. I do think that the unique selling point of Natalie Elphicke, I think it's a bit of embarrassment for Labour to some extent, but it's a much bigger embarrassment for the Tories. But the unique selling point that she provides is the fact that she is the Dover MP. It's in her constituency that migrants are arriving. And for her to be backing Labour is really useful politically. I don't think equivalent types of MPs will necessarily have quite the same offer. But I mean, Rachel's right in terms of, a signal that says, we don't want these ghastly people voting for us. They're the wrong types of voters is not where Labour ought to be. But I think there does come a point where you start to say, what does Keir Starmer really stand for? Is there no line that cannot be crossed?
I mean, you've sort of answered Edward's question there, which is how much do political defections actually help parties? I mean, I guess the answer is it depends who it is and where they're based.
I think it does, but there's if you like, there's a sort of virtuous circle here. Partly you tend to get parties that receive defections are parties that are on the up, parties that suffer losses tend to be parties on the down. And that's clearly the situation at the moment with Labour and Conservatives. And also, a defection, as we talked about earlier, does have a demoralising effect on the party losing an MP. I'm not sure this particular defection has had an uplifting effect on the Labour Party. It appears not, but it does demoralise a party that is already on the down. So, look, I mean, for most people, they probably will forget much about this. To the extent they will remember it, it is likely to be another Conservative MP has gone over to the Labour Party. And that's 3 in this Parliament, 2 in the last month or so. that is by and large very helpful for Labour and difficult for the Tories.
And putting that into context, David, because when you wrote for the New Statesman just last week about, it doesn't actually happen very often, does it? People crossing the floor, and here we've had, 3 in very quick succession. I mean, can you put it into some context about how it is quite significant, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's sort of 8 defections from one main party to another since 1904, starting with Winston Churchill. And then there was a pause until the 70s and Reg Prentice going from Labour to Conservative. There were a few in the Blair years. There were 1 or 2 with Gordon Brown as well. But it's very, very rare. It doesn't happen often. And it's not surprising. I mean, when people do become really very committed to their parties, and it is more common for someone to sort of decide to leave their party, or indeed be kicked out of their party, which was my experience.
Were you ever tempted to defect?
No, I wasn't. I mean, that's a sort of interesting one, is that you sort of feel, okay, I'm not quite part of my tribe anymore, but I'm not part of another tribe. And it was, quite difficult to go over. I certainly would have found that very difficult to go over and say, well, I belong in another tribe. So yes, it is pretty unusual. There's usually an individual story behind it. There are particular factors. I mean, I argue in a piece for the New Statesman this week that this is not a sort of sign of a wholesale realignment in British politics. I think there is a scenario where you could imagine a wholesale realignment where, large parts of what was the sort of liberal end of the Conservative Party might go to a sort of different type of Labour Party. But I think the Starmer project is largely one about rebuilding the old coalition of Labour voters and winning back lots of working class voters, and perhaps class has a bigger part to play in the Labour Party now than it did, say, under Tony Blair. There was an alternative sort of strategy, which there's been some talk about how Tony Blair was advocating that back in the Corbyn years, of the Labour Party becoming the party essentially of those of open values, largely, if you like, sort of party of Remain. And that's not the direction Keir Starmer has taken the Labour Party. But I think had Labour gone down that route, it's not to say that they would be doing better in the polls, probably not, but at least in the short term. But I do think at that point you might have seen a more fundamental realignment. I think this is still more about individuals on individual journeys. So people like Nick Bowles, for example, who has been out there campaigning for Labour, advising the Labour Party, introduced Rachel Reeves at a recent speech. Now, Nick I know very well, and I know that Nick was saying, going back 5 or 6 years ago, saying, actually, I've concluded that I belong on the centre left, not the centre right. And that's clear. That clearly wasn't a careerist move at the time, because the centre left wasn't looking too clever back in 2018 and 2019 either. But he had gone on a political journey. It's a more straightforward and understandable journey than the journey that evidently Natalie Elphicke has gone on. But this is very often to do with particular individual factors. And again, Dan Poulter on the left of the Tory party, I think there's sort of a bit of, I'm sure there are sort of personal individual factors. Maybe it is his background as a doctor that has driven him there. It's that rather than a big realignment.
David, can you give us the inside account of what happens? Now, you didn't defect, and you've said quite clearly why, but what will happen when an MP chooses to do so practically?
I think there's a couple of points. First, office accommodation. So the whips will probably want to move somebody out of where they are, because they'll probably be in an area with other Conservative MPs in this particular case. And I think that's what's happened with Natalie Elphicke. It's also a way of, if you like, punishing people. So you're now Labour's problem to accommodate. So that will happen. There might there's also going to be an issue in terms of your constituency office, say, if you're, as was my case, what I used as a constituency office was also shared by my constituency association, when there wasn't an issue for me when I ceased to have the whip. But that can create some difficulties. So, she might be scrabbling around within the constituency and how to do that work. You might also have issues with your staff. Your staff might have signed up because they're committed Conservatives and they want to work for a Conservative MP and now find that they're working for a Labour MP. Again, that depends on personal circumstances, but you might have that as an issue to deal with.
Has that happened, do you know, in this case?
I don't know what the situation is here. It very much depends on, the individuals, but, very often your constituency staff or your parliamentary staff, are party supporters and first, and then they come and work for you, and they may not be prepared to work for a Labour MP. So it can be quite tricky, I think, at a practical level. As I say, I didn't really have any of those practical issues when I ceased to have the Tory whip in 2019, but a defection is much more complicated.
So we've been quite jovial, but actually it's quite a big decision for a politician to make.
It is a big decision, and you're going to be cutting yourself off from people who will be friends, who have campaigned for you against the Labour Party for many years, and it's quite a big thing. And of course, one shouldn't forget the staff as well, who are kind of caught up in this, and presumably didn't know what was happening until the very last moment. So a lot of issues, can run into issues with friends and family and what have you. So it must be a pretty turbulent, tumultuous time, and involves a lot of personal change. It must be in a way quite a traumatic event.
I think the personal relationships aspect is quite important. I was chatting to an MP who was very good friends with Christian Wakeford, who defected in 2022. And after his defection, this other MP, they'd been very close. They campaigned together. He kind of had to go to the whips and say, just so you know, I know he's now a Labour MP, but he's still my mate and we're still going to, go for drinks together. And if you see us chatting, that's not a sign of betrayal. It's just that, we get on. And I hadn't really thought about that as a consideration, that suddenly you do make very close, quite intense friendships in Parliament because it's such a bizarre, intense place, and how a change in party alliance could really throw a spanner into that and be something that you had to justify.
Rachel, do you think it's a sign also of just how disaffected some MPs are with the Conservative Party? I mean, 3 defections out of, I think, 8 in nearly 120 years. I mean...
And I actually think the first one of those, Christian Wakeford, in 2022, is in some ways really quite significant, because that was a defection really based around disgust at Partygate, disappointment with where Boris Johnson was taking the party and the government. And that wasn't the thing that triggered the downfall of Boris Johnson, but it was very much part of that journey, and a signal that even MPs who had benefited from Johnson's electability were really very dissatisfied with what was going on. And I think that helped give the trend a bit of momentum. I was thinking back to the question, Lizzie's question, are there any Tory MPs that Starmer wouldn't accept into the Labour Party? And I was thinking about Jacob Rees-Mogg. And I actually think, and David can disagree with me on this, but I think if Jacob Rees-Mogg outlined really passionately all the reasons why he had actually had this massive conversion, change of heart. Exactly. And he outlined what it was about Keir Starmer's programme that he felt really passionate about, and why he didn't think that Sunak he sort of changed his mind. I'm not saying Keir Starmer would accept him, but I think the further right wing the individual is, the more unusual, the stronger they have to make the case. And if you are going to say, actually, I think that the situation the country's in is so dire that I actually do think Keir Starmer has the answers more than the current Conservatives, I'd imagine people in Labour would think about that.
David, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Labour MP, would they welcome him?
Well,
If he made the case really strongly.
Yeah, no, I suppose that's right. I mean, I find it implausible that Jacob would do that. Rachel's right in the sense of yes, of course, if someone can articulate why they were doing it, then yes. But can I? I mean, I do know Jacob pretty well, and
he might have to give up his
him.
show on GB News as well.
Yeah, I can't see it happening either.
It's just not going to happen. But I mean, the wider point is, can you come out and articulate a reason why? But are there things that people may have said or done that would preclude them? I mean, the Liz Truss one is an interesting one.
I don't think they take Liz Truss.
No, I mean, my gosh, Rishi Sunak would be delighted if they would. I mean, I think that would be that might be the extraordinary game changer he needs to fight the next election. So no, I'm very confident that Keir Starmer will draw the line there.
And I'm going to say one thing in defence of Natalie Elphicke, who I should say I don't know and I've never met or spoken to. Her views on immigration and borders put her very much on the radical right of the party and on Brexit and part of the ERG. But the other thing that she talked a lot about in her defection statement was housing and the government's failure to build more houses, to really commit to leasehold reform and rental reform. It's something that she has been talking to Labour's John Healey about. That is not it's not a right-wing view, it's not a left-wing view. It's something that she's genuinely been passionate about. And can you see, if you take Brexit and immigration and border control out of the equation, if you start looking at other issues, does she start to look a bit more like a pragmatic centrist? Please, could we build some more houses for young people? Please, could we address social mobility in this country by giving people opportunities? Maybe there's more of an alignment on some of those issues. That is the end of my Natalie Elphicke defence. Well,
I think we see it more widely, sort of these labels of left and right are becoming increasingly meaningless anyway, is my two penneth worth. But
well, it's also true to say that voters don't think of themselves particularly in that way. So that is absolutely the argument for it. That it comes back to Rachel's earlier point. Voters will have a range of views. They will not be universally left-wing or right-wing. Probably most voters have got some views that are quite strikingly right-wing and quite strikingly left-wing. So being, that's the case for not being purist about these matters.
Thank you both very much indeed. And thank you to everyone who has submitted a question. We do read them all, so please do keep them coming. And if you'd like to send us one, just go to www.newstatesman.com/you-ask-us. If you're listening on Spotify, just scroll down on the episode page and leave a reply. And on YouTube, you can drop a question into the comments.